Bismillah, the next section talks about breaking the fast due to intercourse or copulation. Imam, he says, whoever copulates, considered such when the male glands is totally inserted into genuine genitalia. So this, of course, rules out what they consider to be hermaphrodites. If it's not the main genitalia, but the secondary. And this copulation also includes being done anally. This breaks the fast. During the day of Ramadan, the daylight hours is what we're talking about. Of course, intimacy is permitted in the evening after the adhan for Maghrib up until the adhan of al-Fajr, even though that period just before Salat al-Fajr or the adhan of Fajr is disliked to do that. He says even during a day when refraining is required, like a traveler after their return or the ill after they recover. So basically here you're talking about someone that was traveling and is now back in the city, back in their hometown during the day. So they're required to refrain from the muftirat, those things which break the fast, including intercourse. Or someone that was ill and then recovered during the day, even though they broke their fast, for example, for the beginning of the day, if they recovered during the day, they have to fast the remainder of the day. He says, is required to make it up and pay an expiation regardless if ejaculation occurs or not. So this is the result of intercourse or copulation during the day of Ramadan in these previously mentioned circumstances, that you have to make up the day, of course, and there's also an expiation that has to be paid regardless of the outcome. And this should be noted, this is a major sin. He says, if ejaculation of either pre-orgasmic medhi or orgasmic fluid medhi is reached by outer course, this is not intercourse, outer course is like foreplay, etc., or a woman is excused due to ignorance, heedlessness, or coercion, it must only be made up without requirement of an expiation. So here we're talking about the difference between intercourse and outer course. Intercourse requires, of course, making up the day and expiation. Outer course requires only the makeup of a day. Like a traveler who copulates while fasting on a journey which permits shortening prayer, or due to an illness which permits breaking the fast. So here you're talking about someone that is permitted to break their fast, but they fasted anyway, like on a journey. Or their illness permits them to break their fast, but they actually decide to fast anyway. And during that time period of fasting, they decide to be intimate, they will only have to make up the day. And the reason for that is because due to their current situation of either traveling or being ill, their fasting is like voluntary fasting, which is permissible to break. But because it is an obligation to fast all the days of Ramadan, they have to make it up. So essentially what's happening here is they're breaking their fast with their intention to no longer fast again, and then the intercourse happens to proceed that. It says if one copulates in 2 days, meaning day 1 and day 2, be they consecutive, like Monday, Tuesday, or not, meaning like Monday, Wednesday as an example, there are 2 expiations to be paid because each day is an individual act of worship. So if you have intercourse on Monday, there's an expiation for Monday. Even if you don't pay it until later, and then Tuesday, there's an expiation for Tuesday that has to be paid. Each day is different. If it, meaning copulation, is repeated in 1 day, there is 1 expiation so long as the first has not been paid. If, however, copulation is repeated on the same day after the initial expiation is paid, another is due. So basically the scenario is that if on Monday, for example, you're intimate during the daylight hours of Ramadan, there's intercourse, then you have to pay the kafara. Obviously you have to make up the day. But if, for example, in the morning you're intimate with the spouse, you don't pay the kafara, and then an hour or 2 later you're intimate again, how many's due? 1. But if the first time you're intimate, you immediately rush to pay the kafara, and then you fall back into that sin again and you are intimate, then you have to pay a second kafara even though it occurred on the same day. It says it is not voided for whoever copulates and then falls ill, loses their mental faculty, or travels. Basically meaning that if you copulate or have intercourse before you're permitted to break your fast, it doesn't void the expiation. Simply because you happen to travel later that day, or you lost your mental faculty, or you fell ill later that day. You still have to deal with what you did early in the day while you are perfectly capable of fasting and obliged to do so. It says, or travel just like someone who copulates and then dies during the same day, meaning the kafara is still an obligation upon them even if they passed away. It now is being passed on to someone else, or it should be made by someone else. He says there's no obligatory expiation for anything besides copulation during the day of Ramadan. So this is the one thing, this is the biggest sin when it comes to breaking the fast. And this is the only one in which there's an expiation. Obviously, you have to make up the day for all the other things in which you break your fast, but this one is coupled with an expiation. He says, since there's no other explicit report deeming such, meaning there's nothing else that would say that we have an expiation for other things, nor is there anything else equivalent to intercourse during the daylight hours of Ramadan. Now that you've talked about the basic ideas behind copulation during the day of Ramadan, what is the actual expiation? He says the expiation for copulating during the daylight hours of Ramadan is the manumission of a believing bondservant, essentially to set a slave free, who is not disadvantaged in a manner which impedes performance. So this is very theoretical at this point. If you were to find a bondservant who is elderly that cannot work, or is crippled that cannot work, so you need to find someone that is healthy in order to free them. It says if one bondservant is not available, it is fasting 2 consecutive months, 60 days, which if not possible is feeding 60 poor people. So that's how the expiation works, is either you free a slave. If you're unable to do that, you fast for 2 consecutive months. If you're unable to do that, then you feed 60 poor people. And the amount that you feed is 1 mud of wheat. 1 mud is essentially a double-handed scoop, or half a sa'a of dates. Half a sa'a is 2 double-handed scoops like this. And that is of raisins, dates, barley, or dried yogurt. For each person, they receive that amount. If that, meaning that amount of food needed to feed them, is not available, it, here meaning the expiation, is voided due to the narration of the Bedouin, who is not assigned an alternative expiation, nor informed that it was a liability after having been permitted to feed his own family the dates the Prophet ﷺ gave him to cover his expiation. Essentially, this hadith, it talks about how a Bedouin came to the Prophet ﷺ and confessed to having had intercourse with his spouse during the daylight hours of Ramadan, and the Prophet ﷺ told him what he had to do. He had to free a bondservant. He could not do that. He asked him, can he fast 60 days or 2 months? He said he could not do that. He asked him, could he feed 64 poor people? He said he could not do that. And then the Prophet ﷺ sat for a while thinking, and then he got up and left. And when he returned, he had, an amount of dates that he gave him. And he said, take these and feed people. And the man said, feed poor people. And he said, is there anyone poorer than I am in my house? There's no one else in the city that's in poverty like we are. And so the Prophet ﷺ laughed at this. He smiled, and he said, you take it and feed your family with it. And in another narration, I believe, which is found in Sunan ibn Majah, he said, and make up the day of fasting. And in this hadith, he didn't tell him it was still a liability, nor did he give him a fourth option, which basically indicated that the expiation was now void because he did not have the ability to take care of it. And this is unique to this particular one, not like other expiations which you can find during Hajj or for Dhihar, etc., etc.